Thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone for being here. I have a stellar panel sitting here with me. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, but at the same time I want them to set the scene a little bit and answer the question, what opportunities do digital assets and technologies hold for the UK? And if we could start with Helen, if that's okay.
Thanks very much, Alice, and thanks to Innovate Finance for having me. I've been wanting to come to IFGS, I think, for a long time now, and I'm glad I finally made it here for the 10th anniversary session, so really looking forward to this panel. I'm the CEO of Unblocked, which is a platform for helping companies to accelerate their growth through more effective storytelling and connections. I've worked with a lot of technology companies over the last decade, primarily in the cryptocurrency and blockchain industry, and things have moved on a lot, but I think the opportunity for the UK is really ripe because there are so many potential opportunities for job creation, and it's not just the companies of tomorrow, it's actually the companies of today. If you look at London now and the number of blockchain and cryptocurrency companies that are here or that have offices here, it's vastly different to 15 years ago when I first started working in the industry. So massive opportunity there, and I think also just scaling out a little bit, it's also one of the reasons I came into this industry is that I came from a background in public policy, and I saw that top-down decision-making takes a long time. It's very slow, it's very inefficient, and the way we run most things in the world today is centralized. We have centralized governments, we have large global corporations that are often bigger than governments that are also very centralized in their structure, and we're not really making decisions close to the individual. So decentralization I see as a really important part of why blockchain and cryptocurrency is useful and interesting, because it's very expensive, both financially and socially, for us to make decisions so far away from people's preferences. And the way I see blockchain is kind of this incentive network giving people the power to actually instigate change around things that they care about and use tokenization to incentivize that kind of social change or economic change. So that's why I hope the UK will become a global hub for crypto and for the future of finance.
Thank you. Daniel, could you introduce yourself and also answer the same question?
Yeah, thank you, Alice. So my name is Daniel Seifert. I'm the UK CEO of Coinbase, one of the largest crypto exchanges globally. And we're very thankful and grateful for the invitation by Block to be here. Thank you so much. Actually, just last year, we launched a collaboration on Bitkey. You just saw the product, the video. Where Coinbase are powering the ability to buy and sell Bitcoin on the device. It's a collaboration that seems to be going from strength to strength. Really quite happy about it. As you heard, you can now buy and sell Bitcoin with Bitkey in more than 95 countries. Turning maybe a little bit more to your question there, I think at Coinbase our mission is to increase economic freedom in the world. We're working with the UK government and UK regulators on really bringing the next 1 billion people into crypto. And the promise of that technology in our minds, it certainly is in innovation of finance, and I think we've seen a lot of that, but it goes much beyond the innovation of finance. I think nowadays, if we think data, for example, a ton of the data is held and made profitable by very few industries and firms. And crypto really holds that promise of giving that data back into the hands of the users and working with that.
Elise?
Yeah, happy to. So hi everyone, I'm Elise Soucie, Global Director of Policy and Regulation at Global Digital Finance. We are an open innovation community and members association, and we work with our members to promote best practice, standard setting, and in particular, as policy and regulation lead, we engage a lot with regulators on the emergence of new frameworks and policy and reg for digital finance issues like digital assets. Block are one of our members, so we work with you guys quite a lot, so it's a pleasure to be here today. And For me, I think the real opportunities that the UK has, I'll focus on some of the other aspects, naturally policy and regulation, which is that these global frameworks are not yet set around the world. I know we'll get into it a little bit later what other jurisdictions like the EU and APAC region are doing, but there is not yet that global standard and that consistency across digital asset markets like we see in traditional finance. And so I think for the UK, they really have the opportunity to still be a leader while these frameworks are not yet set. If they can step up quickly and establish a regulatory framework, truly nurture innovation, not just in word, but actually by putting the frameworks into place, I think they could really build on that great fintech heritage. There's a great heritage here of public-private sector collaboration, if you think about CREST and the consortium initiatives that were done in the past. And so that for me would be really where I see the UK can kind of seize this opportunity to be a hub for digital finance.
Great. Will.
Excellent. Well, I'm Will Paul. I am the International Public Policy Lead for Small Business Hardware Payments here at Block. Great to be on the panel with everyone, and thanks a lot to Innovate Finance for another great year of IFGS. I think the way I always phrase it is before I did this, I was a very sober Treasury official, and I don't get excited very often. So, but digital assets actually do excite me, which tells you the promise there. What really excites me is I feel like we've been in a revolution of payments and digital technologies for a couple of years. We had the iPhone in 2008 really kick things off. I remember banking for the first time with Monzo as a UK customer. Square obviously brings new payment forms to the UK, and I think digital assets is an evolution, the next kind of step in that. As I think they are an important complement to fiat and stable and to kind of fiat overall. What they do for me, I think I really like the economic empowerment aspect of digital assets. I think they're giving people the choice of how they want to store their value, when they want to store their value. I think they really help us as a society to question, which intermediaries do we want? Which ones do we need? Which ones are just fee taking? What is holding back maybe growth? And specifically in terms of the technology, I'm very excited on self-custody, very excited about Bitkey, of course. For me, what Bitkey and what self-custody offers is privacy and data kind of integrity. It allows people to control who they're sharing with, when they're sharing. It allows them to kind of manage their own money and not have to rely on people to hold it in a centralized exchange that is subject to those usual risks you have when you have to store so many assets together. And in the future, I think it's going to be the tool that we all carry around wallets, we all carry around Apple wallets, we all use those. Self-custody is going to be that, but for kind of a new economic future. And I'm just excited for the opportunities it gives for UK consumers, and also for the opportunity for the UK to be at the forefront of those opportunities.
Thank you. And let's go back to what you were saying, Elise, about other jurisdictions and what else is happening. What lessons would you say that the UK can learn from other jurisdictions as it charts a policy and regulatory pathways for here in the UK?
So obviously we have to talk about the EU and MiCA first, the Markets in Crypto Assets Regulation, as it is probably the most complete regulatory package that we're seeing at the moment, and it is about to go into force. So the EU has been working on this piece of regulation for several years now. The level 1 is finished. They are now working through the level 2, and there are a lot of consultations out at the moment from ESMA and the EBA about the different practical pieces of how they'll implement this legislation. That is to say, MiCA won't actually be going live until various parts of 2024 and 2025, depending on the specific regulatory technical standards. So that being said, I do think the UK still has an opportunity here while those pieces are being implemented, but they can also learn from and look at what's happening in the EU and what's working and what's not working. And I know, for example, that the UK did that very closely with the advent of their digital security sandbox, which is being consulted on right now. They really looked at the EU's DLT pilot regime. They asked industry what worked and what didn't, and then they moved on and consulted on their own. So there is something to be said there for a second mover advantage. Other countries, I think if we turn and look at APAC, a lot of these regions have actually, like for example, Japan, have had fully fledged digital assets regulation in place for years. And so, you're saying former treasurer, I used to be at the FCA, we used to have quite a lot of meetings with these other jurisdictions who had set up these frameworks, and now I think it's important to appreciate that while some maybe smaller countries were able to be a bit more flexible and agile, it's taken the UK a bit longer, but now that the FCA and Bank of England have the powers, they will need to move quickly. Other things to be learned from APAC, I think you can point a lot to the public-private sector collaborations that's happened there. So for example, HSBC just did an issuance, which was one of the largest that we've seen in terms of digital bond issuances. And the reason that that worked so well was because there was collaboration across every layer of the public and private sector, and it was so widely available. So I think that collaborative nature between public and private sector is something we can learn from there. And you can probably tell that I'm American by my accent. I think what the UK could learn from the US is to not let things like elections slow it down. So I think, quite frankly, in this election cycle, there isn't the bandwidth or the breadth for much new legislation at all, let alone digital finance legislation. And realistically, I don't think we're going to see a lot of overarching regulatory frameworks from the US until after the elections. While the UK might have an election this year, they do not need to let it slow it down because we already have the Financial Services and Markets Act, which passed. The Bank of England and FCA have the powers they need. They can get on with creating the framework, and I very much think they should. So just in brief, I guess, to touch on a few regions there.
Just the whole world, that's fine.
I didn't do Middle East, but we can come back to that if you want to.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on that, Will, Daniel?
Yeah, I can maybe offer like one data point. I think, Elise, you covered Europe and MiCA already very well. I'm going to give you the critical side of the America story because Elise... So I think, one thing I think, we in the UK, what we should not do is like not regulate these crypto assets at all, right? If you think about it, MiCA, Markets in Crypto Assets, had been started drafting on it in 2018. We're now 2024 now, and if you look in the United States, they still don't have legislation on that, right? And so even if they were to do it, it would still take a moment until it sort of came to pass, right? And I think what we've seen in this time is that at the start of this process, about 40% of the global blockchain developer talent was in the United States. Well, nowadays, sort of like 1 or 2 years back, they're now below the 30% mark, right? There's 29%. And 29% actually also happens to be now the level that you see in Europe and UK Europe, right? So I think, we've seen an effect where sort of this absence of regulatory clarity has drawn on the people sort of on the talent side of things and people willing to start companies in this space, whereas actually bolstered UK and EU. So I think that's a very important point to look at.
I might add to the US point if I can, which is I think we're totally right. The US hasn't regulated. And one thing I think the EU avoided quite well, and the UK should also try and avoid, is how partisan the debate is in the US. Absolutely. It's no longer based on fact. It's no longer based on technology. I think if you ask a Republican, the average Republican congressman, they're going to tell you it's the best freedom-loving technology in the world. If you ask your average Democrat, they're probably going to tell you it's for money laundering. And that is such a partisan, divided society and kind of discussion. You never look at actually what the technologies do, what they actually achieve, and therefore what the regulation should be. So I think one thing that I appreciate a lot about the UK already is I think you mentioned it, Elise, was those open kind of conversations about how do we want to regulate, when do we want to regulate, what does the government want, what are the legitimate kind of public policy objectives there, and what is technology, how can we understand that? So I think that's really key. I think the other thing is looking at timing and being really clear on when and how. So in the US, we know, for example, on the stablecoin bill, been promised for many years, it gets held up by very weird things. So at one point, Patrick McHenry, who's the chairman of the House Financial Committee, we're all set to do it. And then, of course, the Republicans got rid of their speaker. And now Patrick McHenry has to go and be the temporary speaker and that sort of stuff. So I think having that pathway, clearly telegraphing that pathway and explaining it is super important. And finally, I think it's also keeping an open mind. I think regulators in the US have decided already what they like and what they don't like. I think there is some worrying concerns that they don't do principles-based regulation. They're trying to pick winners and losers in some categories. And obviously, I think the UK can do it well to keep looking at those products, look at the outcomes, ask themselves, how do we encourage that innovation while still retaining those important consumer protections? So definitely some lessons for the US, and I think we can all agree on that, and definitely from the EU too, which is another great example for the UK to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've got a bit of a split personality on this because my brain that used to work in think tanks and work with policymakers, I know that they're very busy people, they have multiple competing priorities. This is a tough subject to get your head around. It's constantly changing and evolving. First of all, it was Bitcoin, then it was cryptocurrencies, then it was blockchain, then we started talking about DLT, then it was stable coins, then it's DeFi, then it's staking. There's so much to keep learning and tokenization. But the flip side is, I think, our leadership in the UK is a bit fearful of technology. You know, we sort of use it in political speeches as something that makes us sound cool, and we can talk about innovation, and we're so cutting edge, and we're going to have new jobs. But then actually sort of grasping that nettle and saying, this is not like a nice thing to have anymore. Technology is in every single thing we do. So our daily lives are just full of technology. Everything financial is technology. FinTech, in a way, doesn't really exist because financial technology is just what we have. So we need to kind of stop thinking about this, oh, it's a nice thing to have once we've sorted out Brexit and the pandemic and the election and all these other problems that we've got. And, you know, I'm not even going to mention the geopolitical things that we're worrying about right now. But, you know, there's a lot of priorities. But technology isn't just like a nice thing to have after we've dealt with all of that. It's fundamental to our economy and our society.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. And yeah, on that point, obviously, technology is with us every day, but sometimes when we talk about these digital technologies, they can be a little bit abstract to some people. So, Will, could you maybe tell us about anything that we could do to make these technologies more tangible? Any technologies that hold particular promise for everyday application?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's two parts. I think, you know, I always think of my mum in these situations and how am I going to explain Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies to my mum? And to be fair, if you look at the debate around digital currencies, it can be very insular. I think we use very particular terms, so like hodling, for example, is go-to in a business. But if you're going to move into widespread adoption, we've got to think about how to overcome that. I always think of the US congressman who was talking about Bitcoin, and he goes, "It's all well and good, but how's it going to make my burger taste better?" And I think that's the key argument. How are we explaining our use cases? How are we getting that across? And that's the right question to ask. So I think inviting that challenge, taking a step back. Not everyone's going to be immediately sold on Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies. So we've got to really explain it again. In terms of technologies, obviously, I think self-custody is really important for me. I think just the opportunities that self-custody has for security of kind of data is so important. It doesn't stop just at Bitcoin either. I think in future, you're going to see tokenization of stocks, of other assets. That's the kind of place where people may want to also store those assets. They may not want to keep it on centralized exchanges. I think the real promise for me too is around digital IDs and use of self-custody. Right now, if you go out today, you've got to remember to bring your ID, you've got to remember to bring your passport. And there's some information on that they don't particularly need to see. They don't need to see my address when they're trying to check my age. If there's a world in which your self-custody wallet can send the right information to do it securely and to give that information without you sharing stuff you don't want to share, that's very promising for me. So, how are we going to get there? I think it's a lot about explaining clearly, going back to basics. You can see in the Bitkey videos, we're really going for that audience and maybe hasn't come across that before, maybe is new, but might benefit from using those self-custody tools. So I'm personally very excited about self-custody, and I think the kind of digital currency industry as a whole needs to think very carefully about explaining and discourse. And again, I just think about my mum. If you're doing your ad campaign, how are you explaining it to my mum is maybe my message from this.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that? Helen?
I'm probably the flip side of that. So I'm the crypto mom. So I have to explain to my children what I do all day and how they can understand what their mother is actually doing for work. So they're still a bit confused. But yeah, I think for me it's about, as I kind of say to a lot of clients when I'm talking about the marketing, how can you explain the added value of what you do, the innovation of what you do without mentioning any of the buzzwords? So I don't want you to talk about cryptocurrency, blockchain, IoT, AI, anything like that. I just want you to say, I'm making people's lives better or easier by doing X. And I think things like partnerships that we're seeing now, so PayPal issued its own stable coin, but then it's integrated that with Zoom, so it's Zoom with an X rather than Zoom, the Zoom call. You can now send remittances globally, and they've got rid of all the transaction charges. So it's bringing a huge number of people who just want to send money abroad to their friends and family for zero cost into effectively the stablecoin market. But those people don't know it's a stablecoin. They just go on to PayPal, which is a global brand that they already know and trust, and they can just transact. And it's just described as a service, service for sending your money abroad. And I think it's that kind of thing that really does then get a lot more people using the technology. Once they use it, they might then understand, okay, well, how do they do this? Okay, well, it's using this thing called a stablecoin. But the first thing is just, I want to send money abroad as cheaply as possible. And that's the best way to get people into the industry, I think.
Yeah, maybe adding one to this, I think very similar, like Helen was just explaining, right? I think first and foremost for me is the global nature of it's kind of like global currency, right? Like you wouldn't go to, let's say, your vacation in Italy and then think that you would have to download an Italian browser, right? No, because you're kind of like internet is this kind of global technology that is the same everywhere you go. And so we kind of should have the same for money at the end of the day, right? And I think there's a couple of ideas that already came up. I think then what I said earlier about data and owning data, I think one thing that I find very interesting at the moment is, I don't know if you've heard about a new social network called Farcaster, where basically, you join the net, but then you keep your data yourself. And you can actually also interact with that network directly by connecting your wallet, and then sort of it can read from your wallet, but it can also like store from there, meaning they've recently developed a technology called Frames, in which you basically think of it as if it was kind of Instagram, and Instagram you could look at a picture and then you could see a link for, maybe somebody has a handbag or something and you say, that's interesting, right? Let's click on it. And that sort of takes you to the next site. I don't know, that's maybe a website kind of selling these handbags. But then you would have to create an account there again, kind of like share your data again. And then so you've entirely left the network. Whereas with this Frames technology on Farcaster, because it's all run on the blockchain, it's like all connected to your data, connected to the network. Basically, directly in staying in there, you can just click, you just buy that. The commercial transaction and the money sort of side of things gets done in the background. You don't even see it, and actually gets then delivered to your place. I actually had this morning, I received a hoodie. Had something said on-chain on the background. After 10,000 of the same NFT had been minted, that kind of unlocked that hoodie, and I had clicked on that frame and it kind of got sent to me this morning. I had already forgotten about it, to be honest.
It's too efficient.
Exactly, it's incredible.
I would maybe just add one more point on the global aspect here, which I think, to your point that there's so much language, and sometimes those of us that work in this space can very much live in a bubble of everyone else who's thinking about it and understanding it. And I think oftentimes that conversation is also extremely focused on a Western, really tech-rich audience. But I think when we think about the practical aspect of this, there is so much that is happening in the global south on a really practical level where you don't have, for example, CBDCs in the UK or the US for retail purposes. I personally don't see how that improves on an already very seamless experience we already have. But in a country where your national currency is not stable and you could use, for example, a CBDC, or you could use Bitcoin, or you could use other cryptocurrencies to pay for your groceries or use clean water, that's a really practical, tangible use, to the point you made about the remittances as well. These are things that really make a difference, and it's not about the fancy technology for them. This is about using money that is stable in their day-to-day lives. And I think that aspect of the conversation often gets left out as well when we're thinking about the practical side, where it really comes down to how can I pay for something?
Yeah.
And visually as well, I think is the other part, the user interface, user experience. The early kind of Bitcoin wallets, it was kind of like watching a sci-fi movie where they have the sort of green and black and the kind of coding starts happening, and everyone's coding. It was really difficult to use these things, whereas now I think there are so many kind of, crypto-based banking apps, wealth management apps, crypto wallets that are very, very easy to use. And in reference to your example, seaweed farmers getting paid more quickly for the goods they produce, it's an app with an image and you just press, yes or no, or something very simple, and it's all done on blockchain behind the scenes, and that means that woman who's harvesting seaweed gets paid more quickly, but she doesn't know it's on blockchain, she doesn't know it's anything to do with cryptocurrency.
It doesn't really need to be honest.
She will never know that, and she will never need to know that. She may never, be literate enough to even, use a more complex app, but that process of just having an interface that's very simple is the entry point to all this other technology behind the scenes, which is improving her life and her family's life and making sure that she actually gets the benefit of her labor and it's not lost to a sea of middlemen in the chain.
Yeah, definitely. And to add last thought, what's underpinning all of this is trust, right? People won't use these products. They won't be able to, they won't want to use them unless they trust that they're going to do what fiat does right now, which is it's secure, especially in the developer south, right? There is a lot of issues around government inflation, those kind of similar issues. So people will the industry, I think, needs to be more upfront about how it gets people into those products. to think about some of the past history and to accept it has to rebuild that trust, and to put out products that are clear and accessible, and it doesn't feel like you're in the Matrix and something weird's going to happen. But actually, you can go into it and you can see what's going on. You feel in control in directing it, and it's backed importantly, which I think is why also it's important to, as Daniel was saying, that point around regulation. Once you have the government in partnership, once you have them thinking about it and that trust base, you're going to build naturally that from consumers and customers. So I think that's underpinning a lot of what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. I think we will have a few minutes for audience questions in a minute, so get thinking now. But one final one from me, just going back to the UK on this, is whether the UK is on the path to global leadership in this space, and what more can it do? Maybe Daniel, if you could take that one first.
Yeah, I think we heard a lot of examples already about what the UK is already doing very well, and I think the regulation is really a great advantage here, and regulatory clarity is very important because it gives us the rules of the road and kind of the confidence to invest. And I think that's a very, very important point. I think the only point, because Alice, you sort of asked what can the UK do better? I think one important piece for us would be staking. So clarity on staking, because staking is crucially important for retail participation in the space. And if we sort of don't find ourselves on the right side of regulation of this could very easily drive out the retail side of things. That would be very unhappy.
Yeah, I think we want to be on the path. I think the desire is there. I think it's not overt enough. So I would like to see us set more ambitious and audacious goals about where we want to be. I think there's a lot of good thinking that goes on behind the scenes, which maybe doesn't come out into the public debate. There are very good people working on these topics behind the scenes. But for me, I would like us to, as Elise said, hit the ground running after the election, not use that as an excuse to go back 3 years and have to educate all the politicians again about the same things that we've already educated them on the first time round, and just kind of really accelerate what we're doing. Clarity of thinking around stable coins would be helpful, I think. More clarity in general on the regulatory framework, which I'm sure Elise can talk about in more depth. But yeah.
I think, it's that building the regulatory framework, continuing to build at pace. We have seen, the financial promotions regulation. We've seen the consultations on retail stable coins, both at a systemic and non-systemic level. But that's just one piece of what will eventually be a broader framework. And I think that staking piece is really important. Taxation, for example, is really important. But I would also add just a couple other points that the UK could really do. For example, a hygiene factor, which is dematerialization of shares and debt. So I think the Electronic Trade Documents Act was a really good first step in that sort of dematerialization, but it didn't encompass everything. And if you look at countries like France and Luxembourg, shares have been dematerialized since the 1980s. And so I think for those pieces and for the regulation to work, for that clarity to be there across the entirety of the market, it's that hygiene piece, and then also continuing to develop the regulatory framework at pace.
Interesting. I've got two maybe reflections. I think definitely agree with the points raised. One thing that we're seeing in the self-custody area is a little bit of confusion between regulators and government. So when the Treasury is thinking about the travel rule, which is how you pass along information, they at one point were going to ask self-custody wallets to do a certain amount of information transfer. When they finished the consultation, they said, actually, no, we've assessed the risk. We don't think they're high risk. They need to do a certain amount from the crypto asset service provider or the exchange. Meanwhile, we then get a stablecoin consultation, and the bank sort of goes back to that initial stage we did 2 years ago, and it's like, well, we're looking at a self-custody, and we're thinking about these things, and maybe we have some concerns here. So for me, it's partly about making sure that government regulators are on the same page about what they want to do and how they want to do it is really key. Because without that clarity that we don't have, it's difficult to kind of build that innovation and commit to a market. And I think the other piece for the UK is always thinking about education. How are we tooling the next generation, the current generation, to be accessible and using these tools in the future? They're going to be ubiquitous. 20 years' time, we're going to be using this a lot. We should start now by making sure generations have abilities and trust. I think, again, not to bring my mother up too much, but she's somebody who still, I think, was slightly behind the digital payments framework. It's confusing. It can sometimes be a bit, oh, I don't really trust my phone to do this. How are we going to learn the lessons from how we rolled that out to improve it for that next digital stage? So I think really thinking about the education piece of new technologies alongside the regulatory clarity is going to be key for making sure the UK is a hub now and a hub in the future. But definitely good points raised, which I think, fantastic clarity. We've done it for fintechs. We've had a very clear, supportive framework. We've had sandboxes, great licensing. Now it's time to think about the similar aspect for digital assets.
I think your mum should join the panel next year.
Yeah, we should get along. They sure know what Bitcoin is by then, so we'll be the next stage.
Well, thanks everyone. I think we do have a few minutes for questions. I have no idea if there's a mic or something. No? Does anyone have a question?
I have to old school raised hand.
Yeah, raise hand.
Raise hands. No? I have some more questions if no one has. No? Okay, well I will ask another question then. So, we talk a lot in crypto about mass adoption. Just in light of some of the points you've raised today, I wonder what mass adoption looks like to you, especially given what Elise was saying about how money is so different in different countries. There's so many things that people's lives are so different. So what would mass adoption actually end up looking like, or would it look very different depending on where you were? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Yeah.
I can take that first from a regulatory perspective. I feel like I get asked this question a lot, like when will we be ready for mass adoption? When will the institutions be all tokenized? And I'm always like, oh God, it's going to take a really long time, because it will. Because I think if you look at any other technology adoption, if you think about cloud technology, for example, most banks are still not fully transitioned to using the cloud and have physical data storage centers. And that's even with regulatory encouragement to use cloud because it's more secure. And so I think we have a very long road ahead of us when you think about institutional adoption, when you think having everyone using these distributed ledgers, when you talk about the kind of those visions you spoke of in the future of new forms of money and the decentralization. I think we're a really long ways away from that. I think it's going to take years to get the regulatory frameworks in place, and I think it will get years still then for businesses to fully get there. But I think that's why it's so important to continue working on these topics, talking about it, having the public-private sector partnerships, because it is a long road ahead of us, and it really requires everyone to be involved, the education piece as well, not just those of us who are clearly very focused on and interested in this topic.
Yeah, maybe to add to it, I think that looks like fluency for me. It's people's confidence to think of digital assets as another form of payment. It's not sort of a special thing that comes up. And the ETF, obviously the ETF launch in the US is very exciting for a lot of reasons, but it was still sort of a moment. So I think when we look at mass adoption, it's fluency. It's going abroad and being like, actually, I'm going to use stablecoins this holiday because it's going to be easier and cheaper. It's coming home and maybe swapping back to your old wallet. Hopefully soon everyone will walk around with some of these, which is our lovely wallet. But it's
very tactile, by the way. It's very nice to play with in your pocket.
You have to make me, have to convince me to send you Bitcoin, but if you're nice, maybe I will. But for me, it's when those
Satoshi.
maybe a couple. For me, it's when that's the kind of thing that joins your wallet along with your keys, joins with your phone. It becomes more normalized to be using those technologies, and that will come with time and fluency, and hopefully with general awareness. So that for me it's that kind of swapping around that's going to be really key to demonstrate mass adoption.
I think it's akin to smartphones. I mean, if you think about the big debate that's been going on about children and smartphone use and how much should they have and how old should they be when they use it, when nearly everybody in the country has a digital wallet, and we'll be arguing about, well, what age is appropriate for a child to have a digital wallet, and what function should it have, and at what age should they be allowed to, own tokenized assets, or should they only be allowed to do payments? Children have debit card apps at quite a young age now, and they're very familiar with that. And my own daughter even said to me, can the Tooth Fairy just put this money on my Go Henry card, because I don't really use cash, So we've reached the stage where cash is not a thing for young people. And so I think once we get to the point where everyone has a digital wallet, that's mass adoption, or nearly everyone. There may be some people who are ideologically opposed to it, or just older people who haven't adopted it. But I think it will become as ubiquitous as smartphones.
Mm-hmm. Plus one to that, I think that's a great one to end the panel.
Okay, well, I mean, I think we've still got a bit of time left, but we can wrap it up there. Did anyone else have any final words? Yeah? You happy? Okay, well, I'm very happy. So thank you so much to my wonderful panel. Please join me in showing your appreciation.